Gymnosperms are vascular plants that produce seeds, but they don't produce fruits. In this talk, we're going to learn about the general characteristics of vascular plants and know the names of different vascular plants as well as their general characteristics. We will then focus on gymnosperms and learn about the reproductive cycle of gymnosperms as well as the life cycle of gymnosperms. Gymnosperms are vascular plants, and vascular plants have conducting channels in tissues like xylem and phloem. There are three main groups of vascular plants, which are the seedless plants, and the example of that are ferns, and the ones that form seeds, which are the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. In this talk, we're going to concentrate on the gymnosperms, which have the ability to form seeds. However, these seeds are not enclosed in fruits. Now, vascular plants are plants that show life cycles that have dominant sporophytes. So this is different from the non-vascular plants that we learned before, which have dominant gametophytes. In the case of vascular plants, the gametophyte is smaller in size than a sporophyte and is a lot smaller than any of the gametophytes that we tend to see in the non-vascular plants. Now, vascular plants are called vascular because they have developed water-conducting tissues and nutrient-transporting tissues, and these tissues are called as vascular tissues. Xylem is an example of a vascular tissue that transports water in these plants, and phloem is an example of a vascular tissue that transports nutrients like sugars in the plants. Vascular plants, since they have these conducting tissues, they have well-developed roots and leaves. The roots are the part of the plant that anchor the plant to the ground and are able to absorb water from the soil, while the leaves are the part of the plant that perform photosynthesis. Vascular plants also have specialized spore-bearing leaves that are called as sporophytes. When we look at the different groups of vascular plants, they comprise of the lycophytes that are also called as club mosses, the pterophytes that include ferns and other related organisms, as well as the seed plants, which are gymnosperms and angiosperms. To look more into sporophylls are modified leaves with sporangia, and hence they play a role in plant reproduction. Now, vascular plants can be homosporous or heterosporous, and homosporous plants are those that are able to produce only one type of spore that develops into a bisexual gametophyte. On the other hand, heterosporous plants are those that produce two types of sporophylls. The first type of sporophyll is called as the Megaspore, which can give rise to the female gametophytes. You also have the microsporophyll that give rise to microspores, and the microspores give rise to the male gametophytes. Now, all the plants that we have covered so far, including the non-vascular plants and the lycophytes and pterophytes, are plants that do not make seeds. Now, as time passed, the evolution of seed plants occurred, and the evolution of seeds allowed the spores to be retained in the parental sporophyte. In the case of seed plants, the gametophyte formed in the sporophyte is better protected from the environment, and hence the chances of mutations in the gametophyte is rarer. Almost all seed plants are heterosporous, and hence they do show the presence of megasporophylls that will form megasporangia. Now, these megasporangia produce megaspores that will ultimately form the female gamete, and they produce microsporophylls that form microsporangia. The microsporangia will produce microspores that form the male gamete. The seeds are formed after the fusion of the male and the female gamete, which is after fertilization. And the zygote that is formed then undergoes developmental processes to form an embryo. The advantage of a seed is that the seed has not only the embryo, but it also has a food supply for the embryo and a protective covering to protect the embryo until the conditions are favorable for that seed to germinate and for the embryo to form the sporophyte. When we look at seed plants, they can be grouped into two sister clades. The gymnosperms are those that produce seeds that are called as naked seeds. The seeds are exposed on the sporophytes that normally form these cone-like structures. Most gymnosperms are cone-bearing plants and a lot of times called conifers. Gymnosperms dominated the terrestrial ecosystems during the Mesozoic era. However, today, when we look at the plants that dominate our ecosystems, they are the angiosperms. Angiosperms are plants that form seeds which are enclosed in these chambers that form the fruit. As I told you, they're the most widespread and diverse plants, and they have evolved to form these structures called as flowers. So let us first look at gymnosperms and how reproduction occurs in gymnosperms. Gymnosperms are plants that make seeds, but the seeds are not covered by a fleshy covering, which is basically the fruit. The three key features of gymnosperm life cycle include the miniaturization of their gametophytes. Now, in the case of non-vascular plants, the gametophyte was the dominant form during the life cycle, and they were quite large. However, as vascular plants started emerging, the gametophytes started becoming smaller and smaller, and this continued with the gymnosperms. The gymnosperms also found a way to transfer the male gametes to the ovules by forming these structures called as pollen. This allowed the male gametes to go and find the ovules in the absence of any water that was being present. Gymnosperms also started producing seeds, which is a dispersible stage in the life cycle. So by allowing the seeds to be dispersed, then it allowed the plants to travel far distances and form new plants. Now here we have three pictures of gymnosperms, and these include the pine trees. They also include the largest organism on Earth, which are the sequoia trees. Let us now look at the reproductive structures of the gymnosperms. So the gymnosperms have the specialized leaf structure called as sporophytes. Gymnosperms are heterosporous, and so they make microsporophytes, which are shown in the figure in that white box, and the microsporophytes are the ones that will ultimately give rise to the male gamete. In addition to microsporophytes, the plants also make megasporophytes, which is what you can see in the picture. These megasporophytes are the ones where the female gametes will be made. Let us now look at the steps involved in forming the male gametes. And for this, we're going to begin with the microsporophytes, which are the male cones that are produced in the plant. Now, the microsporophytes produce structures called microsporangia, and each microsporangium gives rise to what's called as a microspore mother cell. And here in the picture below, we can see a microspore mother cell. These microspore mother cells undergo meiosis. So remember, the microsporophytes, the microsporangia, all the cells in them are diploid. So to form the male gametes, we need to have a meiotic event to happen. And this happens when the microspore mother cell undergoes cell division. The meiosis results in 4 haploid cells, which are the 4 microspores or the 4 pollen grains. Each microspore forms a wall around them to help protect the cells inside that microspore. The outer wall is the exine and the inner wall is called as the intine. In the case of some gymnosperms, the exine can form these wing-like structures that are shown in those blue circles in the figure. And these wing-like structures facilitate the dispersal of the pollen grain through wind. Now, a single haploid cell that's present in the pollen grain undergoes mitosis to form 2 types of cells, and the first one is a small cell called as a prothallus cell, and the larger cell is called as the antheridial cell. The antheridial cell is also called as the tube cell, and this is what can be seen in that second figure where we can see the large antheridial cell and the small prothallus cell. The prothallus cell then undergoes further cell division to form 2 prothallial cells, and one of these prothallial cells is also called as the generative cell, which is what we can see in the third figure. And so thus, now in that pollen grain, we have 3 cells. We have the prothallial cell, the generative cell, and we have the antheridial or the tube cell. At this stage, the pollen grains can be dispersed by the winds, and once they're dispersed by the winds, they go to try to find the ovules. Now, the transfer of pollen to the part of the seed plant that contains the ovules, which are the female reproductive structures, that process is called as pollination. Now, since there's pollination is through wind, the male gametes do not have to swim in water to find the female gamete. Now, these pollen grains protect the male gamete because they have sporopollen as part of their pollen coat. The pollen grains that are dispersed by the wind will reach the ovule, and they bind to a structure called as the micropyle that's present in the ovule, which we will see in the next couple of slides. The generative cells that are present, they divide to form a stalk cell and a body cell, which is what we can see in that blue box. The exine of that pollen grain then ruptures, and the intine extends into the ovule to form a pollen tube. And there we can see the tube-like structure in that blue box in the figure below. Finally, that body cell that arose from the cell division of the generative cell will undergo cell division to form two male gametes. And the two male gametes can now go through the pollen tube to reach the female gamete. So this is how male gametes are formed in gymnosperms. Let us now look at the formation of the female gamete. Now, as we talked about, gymnosperms are heterosporous, and so they have megasporophylls. These megasporophylls are the ones that will ultimately give rise to the female gametes in them. The megasporophylls produce what are called as megasporangium, and we can see the megasporangium highlighted in the blue box in the figure. The megasporangium is protected by a covering that's called as an integument. This integument is the one that will form the outer covering of the seed. The megaspore is formed inside the megasporangium, and this megaspore is the one that gives rise to the female gamete. The collection of the megaspore, the megasporangium, and the integument all together form what's called as the ovule. Now let us now look at how the female gametes are formed, and for this, let us look at the stage where we have a megaspore mother cell. Now when we look at the figure, here we have an ovule, and in the ovule we can see the outer covering of the integument, and inside we can see these different cells which are diploid, and they form what's called as the nucellus. Now among these cells, one cell forms the megaspore mother cell. And this megaspore mother cell undergoes cell division, and the type of cell division that it undergoes is meiosis, and hence we form 4 haploid cells. Of these 4 haploid cells that are formed, 3 of them are going to degenerate and only 1 is left. This one that is left is called as the megaspore. The megaspore undergoes cell division, and so the megaspore in this case is haploid. So when it undergoes cell division, it is through mitosis to form the female gametophyte. The female gametophyte is also called as the endosperm, and that is what we are seeing in the blue box. So what we're seeing in the blue box is the female gametophyte that formed from the megaspore. Now near the micropyle region, which is the tip region of the ovule, there is a cell formed in the female gametophyte called as the archegonial initial. This archegonial initial cell undergoes cell divisions, as we can see in figure B, figure C, and figure D, to form about 2 to 8 archegonia. And each archegonia that is formed has neck cells and an egg cell, and we can see in the blue box where we see the egg cell. Now when we look at the structure that, or the figure shown in the right, here we can see 2 archegonia that have formed in that megasporangium. Now these archegonia are present in the endosperm, and this endosperm are the cells that are surrounding, which are these haploid cells that are surrounding the archegonia. The archegonia and the endosperm together, they are the ones that are in the female gametophyte. Now, surrounding the female gametophyte are the nucellus cells. Now, nucellus cells are diploid. However, cells that make the female gametophyte are haploid. And so this way we can see that the female gamete is formed. Now let us look at the fertilization step. But before we look at the fertilization step, let's have a quick summary of how the male and the female gametes formed. So let's first look at the female gamete. So here we have the megasporangium that is shown in yellow. And in that megasporangium, a megaspore mother cell is formed that is shown as that purple circle. That megaspore mother cell undergoes meiosis to form 4 megaspores, but out of those 4 megaspores, 3 of them are going to degenerate and you end up with only 1 megaspore. That megaspore undergoes cell division to form the female gametophyte, which can also be called as a megagametophyte, and that is what is shown in purple. Now remember, this purple female gametophyte is haploid. Now there is an archegonial initial cell present in the female gametophyte that is going to give rise to archegonia. Now you can have up to 2 to 8 archegonium that are made in that female gametophyte. And so now we have the female gametes ready. Now let's see what happens with the male gametes. Now the male gametes are going to come in this region that is at the tip of this ovule. Let's call this the micropyle. Near that micropyle, the ovule secretes this mucilaginous drop, which is sticky in nature. So it's a sticky liquid. And the spores that have been dispersed by the winds in the form of these pollen grains, the pollen grains are caught by this mucilaginous drop that is present at that micropyle of the ovule. Now, once these pollen grains have been able to associate with the micropyle, the pollen grain will germinate to form that pollen tube. So this is here, we already talked about that in this case, inside we have like 3 cells, which were the prothallus cell, a generative cell, and a tube cell. And then the tube cell is the one that forms the pollen tube, whereas the generative cell undergoes cell division to form a stalk cell and a basal cell. So here we can see the pollen tube made, and then the base cell that is present is the one that's going to undergo cell division to form 2 male gametes. These male gametes can then now fuse with one of the archegonium egg that's there, and it ultimately forms a diploid zygote that undergoes cell divisions to form an embryo, and this embryo is diploid. So thus we can see the formation of an embryo from the male and the female gametes in gymnosperms. In this figure, we can observe the alternation of generations in gymnosperms. Gymnosperms show a dominant sporophyte that produces cones. In these cones, the gametophytes are formed that give rise to the male and the female gametes. The gametophytes are made within the sporophyte and hence are protected. They are much smaller in size also compared to the sporophyte. The male and the female gametes that are formed in the gametophytes then can undergo fertilization to give rise to a sporophyte once again. In the next slide, we're going to look at the life cycle of a pine.
Gymnosperms are seed plants that have no enclosed chambers around their seeds. Most gymnosperms are conifers, cone-bearing trees such as the pine shown here. The male and female parts of a conifer are found in separate locations and structures on the tree. A pine tree represents the diploid sporophyte phase of the life cycle. Haploid male and female gametophytes develop in cones on adult sporophytes. Gametophytes produce eggs and sperm. Pollination brings gametophytes together, and an egg is fertilized. The fertilized egg develops into an embryo, protected and nourished within a seed. The seed germinates and grows into an adult sporophyte, completing the pine life cycle.
To summarize, we learned about the general characteristics of vascular plants and focused on gymnosperms. We learned about the reproductive cycle of gymnosperms and the overall life cycle of gymnosperms.